Hello and welcome to another episode of the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. My name is Phil Schiavone with the CCO, the Coalition for Christian Outreach Campus Ministry, where we're transforming college students to transform the world. And with me, of course, from Hearts and Minds Books in Dallastown, Pennsylvania, the host with the most about the books you should be reading, Byron Borger. Happy New Year. How are you doing?
Happy New Year to you, Phil, and to all of our listeners out there that join us for this conversation. I'm doing okay. A little chilly today, early January, but man, I am really, really excited to talk today. We're talking about Jubilee, the Jubilee Conference that the CCO does, and books that have been important in that series, in that 50-year history. And so I'm just thrilled to share some titles today. I'm glad to be with you.
Well, I love it. I'm here for it. It's 30 degrees outside. It's 57 here in my basement, and I have to turn the space heater off to record these things. So I've got a heat pack on my lap. I've got the headphones in my ears, as likely like our listeners do too. And I've also got New Year's resolutions that always include books and reading and what I'm going to be talking about this year. And so we've got all sorts of reasons to dive into these books. And Byron, why don't you just kick us off with the first one, if you're ready to.
Well, yeah, I'd love to hear about what resolutions you have, Phil, because you're a pretty intentional guy anyway. So I'm excited to hear that you're resolving to read more books. Mm-hmm. And maybe some of your listeners out there will want to order some books from Hearts and Minds. Man, we need the business, believe me. So send some orders our way and care about these books. Last time we were together, and this episode went out right before Christmas. So if you missed it, go back and listen to that. We kicked off a new kind of series, a sub-series here for the next couple of episodes that we're going to do on books that have been important and a big Jubilee Conference that the CCO runs, kind of its flagship event where they disciple students and invite students into the story of God, the creation, fall, redemption narrative that can shape how we think about everything. And therefore, your major and your studies matter to God and your future vocation as you serve God as salt and light in the work world. So that's sort of the big picture of much of what the CCO does as they do discipleship and evangelism on campuses to invite people into that kingdom vision. And so books that have been important at that event are the titles we're going to be sharing over time here over the next couple episodes. I said last time, if you didn't hear it, and Phil, you might find this interesting, Beth and I were not the booksellers at first. We were still on campus when we cooked up this idea of the Jubilee Conference. We were on the first committee that ran the very first one. I worked at a branch campus of Penn State University out in McKeesport, PA in the late 70s. And so I took students to the conference and just so enjoyed hanging out with kids at that conference as a young adult. Then we got on the committee to run the conference. And so we were not only bringing students, but we were helping to plan the event. And then Beth and I got this vision to come back to central Pennsylvania, to our old kind of stomping grounds here in central PA, and open Hearts and Minds. But there was already a bookseller selling books with the CCO, a good guy named Wes Servold, an old acquaintance of mine. And then one of my old college roommates joined him, Ray Red, who's now at Waynesburg University. And so Wes and Ray ran Radix Books, and they stood up at the Jubilee Conference and highlighted titles and had books on sale, just like I do at the more recent Jubilees. So I stand on the shoulders and in debt to Wes and those guys that taught us how to sell books at Jubilee. When they got out of that business, then the CCO invited us to come back. We were no longer working with the CCO anymore because we had the bookstore, but they asked us to come back and do a book display. It was at the Hilton Hotel in those years, down at the Point in Pittsburgh. And we outgrew that, 15, 20 years ago. So it's been quite a journey for us, and I hope your listeners find that a little interesting, that we were just CCO workers going to this event with our student friends and running the event as a person on the committee helped planning it. Tom McWhirter, who's since died. Tom was one of the first directors of that conference, and then other people have come and gone. Steve Garber and Pegger Dixon have directed that conference over the years, but books have always been a part of the story. So we highlighted some last time that were big those first couple of years. And now I'd like to move into sort of the second era, the 80s maybe, or the 90s. Again, really big years for the CCO and big important conferences. And there were a couple of books that came out that were almost, I call them quintessential. We still highlight them at Jubilee some years from up front. They're still bought and sold in the CCO circles. And the first one, well, I'll tell you what, let me back up. Before I tell you the first one, I got to tell you about two other books that are no longer available, that are out of print, but I want to give a shout out to them, written by four CCO people. There were four guys that thought, like, we need a book to sell at Jubilee that actually articulates this wide as life redemptive vision. And there just weren't easy to read books. There were philosophical ones and theological ones, but there weren't any like really accessible, fun ones. And so out of the Jubilee Conference, they told some stories of the Jubilee speakers and things that happened at Jubilee. And the first one was called All of Life Redeemed. It was written by four CCO friends, Bill Ingram, who worked in the office and he has since died. Tom McWhorter passed away a couple of years ago. Tom was the original founder of the head of the committee that founded the conference. Bill Romanowski up at Grand Rapids, retired from Calvin University, and Brad Fry, that's in Beaver Falls there at Geneva College, teaching sociology there. Brad, Bill, Tom, and Bill Romanowski wrote a book called All of Life Redeemed. The subtitle was Biblical Insights for Daily Obedience. The great theologian J.I. Packer, whose book Knowing God I mentioned last time, J.I. Packer called them, with a kind of allusion to the Beatles, he's British, he called them Pittsburgh's Fab Four, which a lot of us tease them about because it's such a kind of odd thing to say, but they were like the Fab Four, the Beatles of Pittsburgh, that put together this upbeat, lively, creative, fun book called All of Life Redeemed. A couple of years later, those same four guys did another sort of follow-up to the All of Life Redeemed sort of reformational worldviewish vision, and it was called At Work and at Play. And they got different CCO people to help them with that. They did much of it, but also some other guys, Glenn Salo and some others, I think, helped with other chapters on work and play and business and science and athletics. And they did this sort of reader of what it looks like to serve God in every zone of life, or in several zones of life. And that was called At Work and at Play. That came out in 1990. So from 83, All of Life Redeemed was the big book in CCO work, or CCO circles. And then in 1990, At Work and Play came out. They were both published by an outfit in Canada called, in Ontario, called Paideia Press. And Paideia Press eventually went under. The books went out of print. You can't get them anymore. They're really rare. You can find used, banged up ones here and there on the internet. But I don't even have mine anymore. I've sold my last ones, and I don't even have my own personal copies anymore. So I can't even look at them for nostalgia. Bonnie Leifer in the CCO office did the covers of those two. And Tony Campolo wrote the foreword to one of them. So, yeah, they were good books in the 80s and 90s by those four guys, Brad Fry and Bill Romanowski, both who are still alive. The other two have passed. And they did those two books. I don't even know if you've heard of those, Phil. Some of the really old timers that have worked for CCO for a long time, Ginger Weber or whoever, they would know those books and love them well. But they sadly went out of print, and then the company went under, and you can't even get them anymore. So those are the two I wanted to start with, even though they're out of print. So they don't quite count as our three books from Hearts and Minds.
Well, I don't know the book titles. I do know a bunch of those names at this point, just having been around Jubilee now for 20 some years. And so the names excite me, but gosh, the titles give it away, right? Like some of those titles are just the blood that pumps through the veins of the Jubilee Conference and of the ministry we do with the CCO. So just you saying those titles, I was over here just giggling because they're just right down the alley of what we do.
Yeah. It's interesting that so many of the influences of the CCO in the earliest days of the CCO, the 1970s, some of what they studied was really academically rigorous. Books about hermeneutics and books about philosophy and books about worldview, some that were translated from the Dutch, Herman Duyvert, a Dutch philosopher. And we read this kind of heavy stuff, and Wes was strong on those books. But man, a lot of staff didn't even understand some of those titles, let alone our young students.
Sure.
Students were sharp in those days, and they were thoughtful, and they would buy those books. But I know for a fact that some of them were just over our students' heads. They were over my heads. And so we were longing for a resource that would be fun and vibrant and exciting, but that would capture this wide as life, all of life redeemed worldview, and without using all the lingo. And so all of life redeemed really was a refreshing contribution to sort of ways to navigate this worldviewish philosophical language from Francis Schaeffer on down to sort of the daily ordinary stuff of a typical college student in Western Pennsylvania in the 1980s. So I love those books. They were useful. There's been talk about redoing them, getting them out in print again or whatever.
Sure.
But they were important books, and I just wanted to give a shout out to those. So now we got 3 that are still in print, that are still sold, that I want to tell you about now. And so for the 3 books from Hearts and Minds this time, we'll look at 3 classics from the Jubilee era from the 1980s and 90s. In 1985, this was just a couple of years out of All of Life Redeemed being written, a guy named Al Wolters came to the CCO. This would have been in 84. He joined us for summer staff training. In those days, you'd do 2 weeks of theology and 2 weeks of counseling or ministry and 2 weeks of worldviewish, philosophical, cultural engagement stuff. So we had long staff training and 2 full weeks with Al, and he would lecture all day, morning and afternoon, 5 days a week, 6, 7 days. And so we spent a lot of time with Al. And the material he presented to us was how to discern sort of a Christian understanding of all of life, including the philosophical assumptions behind different ideologies and ideas, our view of the person, our view of the government, our view of money, our view of whatever, how we think Christianly with a renewed mind. But to do that, we have to have a Christian set of lenses to interpret everything. And he said those lenses have to be polished up in light of the scriptures. So his book, Creation Regained, came out of his teaching the CCO staff how to think faithfully about doing ministry in the context of higher education. If we're working with ideas, with theories, with classrooms, with textbooks, with future careers, if we're working with young scholars, we have to integrate faith into the classroom, not just kind of get people saved so they can go to heaven or do evangelism outside the dorms, but rather what it means to look like to take faith into the classroom. And so this academic discipleship, as we called it, for this full vision needed to come out of a worldview, and that worldview needed to be shaped by the Bible. So Al is mostly a biblical scholar. His first degree was in theology, but he shifted to become an Old Testament professor. And Creation Regained were the lectures he gave to CCO staff that eventually was put into a book. The book was dedicated to the CCO. So we're pretty thrilled that the Creation Regained book came out of CCO staff training. That then was published, dedicated to CCO, as I say, and was mostly a Bible study around the holistic themes of creation, fall, and redemption. That these themes, the goodness of creation and the sturdy reality that God made the world and ordered it well, and that it fell into sin, paradise lost, and every nook and cranny of the world is no longer what it was meant to be. So everything is ruined, but not ultimately ruined. Sin is just a parasite, kind of wrecking stuff. But the sturdiness of the creation endures, and Jesus comes back to save all things, to renew all things, to restore all things, and wipe every tear from our eye as he straightens out the crookedness of the world. And so Jesus's redemption is all of life redeemed. Creation, fall, and redemption are not unusual theological categories. Every Christian tradition talks about how God made the world and made it good, and how sin is deadly, and how Jesus is saving. But few Christian traditions, particularly in those years at the end of the 20th century, fleshed out all the implications of those doctrines. So what Al was saying wasn't so much new, other than he was underscoring it and saying it was such vivid implications of a holistic doctrine of creation and a radical view of sin and a holistic understanding of redemption. and the promise then of restoration and hope as Jesus comes to renew the creation and make it what it was always meant to be. So those themes are now the actual watchwords of the conference. And as anybody that's been to Jubilee in recent years knows, it didn't used to be this way, but in recent years, the first night is a doctrine of creation, what it means we're made in God's image and have a holy task. And then the Saturday morning talk will be about the brokenness of sin and fall and idolatry and those kind of dark themes of how things are not as they're meant to be. And students nowadays really want to own that stuff. They know the world is messed up. And so they feel that in their bones. And to talk about that lament stuff on Saturday morning at Jubilee is often very renewing and very energizing for students as we spend some time being honest about the brokenness of the world. And then we get to the great gospel message of Jesus's death and resurrection on Saturday night, the invitation to become transformed by the person of Jesus who shed his blood. And then the ending of the conference, Sunday morning, is always about hope, about the restoration of future redemption, and that the redemption is this world being transformed into the world it was always meant to be as creation is regained. That very phrase, creation regained, is still the theme of the Jubilee Conference. This is the second edition of this book. When it first came out, it had a certain number of chapters. And then when they did the 10th anniversary edition, a guy named Michael Goheen, who's spoken at Jubilee. Michael Goheen added a new chapter and they added a new preface. And so this is a little bit more meaty and a little more missional about how all this stuff matters. And so we love this edition of Creation Regained, a fairly dense writing and not a lot of jokes and goofing around. It's deadly serious. With some application, but it's just laying out the biblical foundation for what we might want to call a reformational worldview, not just reformed, although the CCO has some reformed roots, but this notion of being reformational, which is this phrase of how creation, fall, redemption, and consummation tell the story of all of life redeemed. And that reformational philosophical phrase is in the subtitle of this book. And it to this day is one of the main books we've sold year after year after year at Jubilee. Again, it came out of the CCO staff fellowship time in '84. The first edition was dedicated to the CCO. It then was issued in 1985, and then eventually an expanded edition came out as well. The original edition was white. Some of you have seen that. John Stott, who at the time was still alive living in England, bought the rights to this and published a little mass market paperback. It has a leaf on the cover with really cheap paper. It was made cheaply to use in the third world. He thought it was so important that John Stott wanted to get this book out, and with a few other titles started this sort of mass market small distribution for international sales. And I have some of those too. It's kind of a red book with a leaf on the cover. It's pretty cool. And that's the old edition. And now here's the newer edition. So that's the first one that is just quintessentially Jubilee and tells the story of Jubilee and was written, in fact, for CCO staff. So isn't that pretty neat? Creation Regained by Al Wolters.
Yeah, I love it. I read through it recently with a friend who newer friend in my life that was not familiar with creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And so we walked through the book together and we ended up having this fantastic conversation about trees. He basically asked some sort of question of like, you're really telling me the gospel matters as much as for trees as it does for souls? And we had this great conversation about it. And we walked out of the coffee house and I caught him staring off and I was like, what are you looking at there? And he's like, oh, they're taking that tree down over there and I could just watch them take care of that tree all day. I was like, well, that's it. This connection of the gospel between all things and the fact that we can be just drawn into humans partaking with the care of a tree in downtown, whatever town we're in, is exactly it. That's this wonderful movement of God that not only cares for our souls, but cares for the trees and cares for city planning, cares for the economy, cares for the worker. You nailed it. And we had this, laugh over it because it was this attempt to connect those dots. But there are just few books that connect the dots as well as Creation Regained. And that's why it continues to be a staple, even for me here in now 2026 in my conversations with my friends.
I'm so glad to hear that. And we are tasked with kind of making it more practical, talking about trees, talking about how we live our ordinary day-to-day lives, our sports, our recreation, our meals. He doesn't get as practical as he might in this book, but he
Sure.
does call for a societal renewal, that it's
Yeah.
all of life redeemed, that in our personal heart of hearts, we come to a new intimacy with Jesus, but that spills over into all of life. And so there's a chapter in here called Structure and Direction that's worth the
Yeah.
price of the book as
Yeah.
well. So yeah, this is a great one. Now here's what's interesting. That came out in 1985. The year before that book came, in 1984, a book came out called Transforming Vision. And Transforming Vision are guys that studied under Al Wolters and beat him to the punch and wrote this book before Creation Regained came out. They were both popular in the mid 80s and again continued to be spoken of, used in CCO staff training events. I know some of our staff did a cohort study of this book together this year. It's by two guys, both who were at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, a kind of Christian graduate school that was very philosophically oriented, particularly in those days, a philosophical graduate school in Toronto, ICS, Institute for Christian Studies, and ICS would always send their faculty down to help lecture at Jubilee. Probably everybody that was on staff in those years, Calvin Serveld and Hank Hart and Jim Olthius, all had at some point or another been to Jubilee. Well, Brian and Richard were studying there, and they were both part-time working for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Brian was an InterVarsity staff person in Canada, became one of N.T. Wright's best friends, by the way, as he shared this information with N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright's big, fat, multi-volume set, each one's about 800 pages, and it's 5 volumes. It's dedicated to Brian Walsh. And it starts off talking about world and life views, how worldviews shape history and interpretation and everything that we study theologically. That even before theology, there's sort of this philosophical, even pre-theoretical, they call it, before philosophy, this sort of imagination of the heart. That there are these imaginations and these visions and these sort of assumptions that we make deep down about the nature of things. That's the worldviewish nature of the pre-theoretical commitments that we bring that help us see everything. They really are like glasses that we just see everything. It's a vision, not sort of a systematic set of ideas. Worldview is not primarily intellectual, but it's pre-intellectual. It's of the heart, not just of the head. So they call this book Transforming Vision. The subtitle was Shaping a Christian Worldview, not the Christian worldview. They're not so pompous as to think that they get everything right, but it's their imagination, their take on what it looks like to have a Christian worldview. Now, like Al Wolters, because they were studying under him at the time, they understood that a worldview that's going to be biblical has got to capture the meta-narrative, the flow, the narrative of the story of creation, fall, redemption. And so creation, fall, redemption is in this book, just like it's in Al's book, although with different words and different language and different Bible verses, but they still, again, talk about the enduring nature of the goodness of creation and our human task to care for that creation. That's primarily who we are. We're earthlings. And our fundamental task in Genesis 26, 27, 28 is we're made in God's image to work and create, to be caretakers of the world, to develop creation, and certainly at the very least to steward it well, to care for it well. So they do a good work on creation. Everything's messed up. There's sin and idolatry everywhere, and they name that really well. And then the holistic lordship of Jesus over all of life, they just get at that gloriously. So the creation, fall, redemption story here, not unlike Al Wolters, is sort of similarly robust and holistic and broad, looking at the implications of those doctrines. But here's what this book does that Al does not do very much. They set the context of the creation, fall, redemption Christian worldview in light of the problems of Western culture. In other words, they say this, and this is sort of a quick summary of this book. They say that when one has a dualism, a sacred, secular dichotomy, where you don't really live for all of life being redeemed, but only your spiritual life and your church life and your doctrinal life, well, then other areas of life still have to go on. You still have to have economics and banking and schools and art and sports. And so that stuff continues to develop in human history. But if churches have sequestered themselves into the so-called spiritual realm, we've let then all that other stuff be developed devoid of Christian perspectives. In other words, given the world to the devil. And so we keep God for ourselves and share people to come to church. But the bulk of culture is developed by ideologies and philosophies and imaginations and values, what the Bible calls idols. And those idols have shaped the Western world. So they try to show that Western culture has developed historically for 2,000 years, devoid of Christian content, devoid of a Christian worldview, and consequently idols have shaped the way science and politics and nursing and engineering has all developed. So they look at the secularization of the West, where that came from. It sounds really academic, and whole multi-volume books have been written on that. But in a couple of succinct chapters, they name the problem with Western modernity and its secularization due to our yielding those things to the devil, to idols, because we've thought Jesus only cares about your soul. So because we don't have a Christian worldview that's robust, we've compartmentalized our faith. We've allowed secularization to carry on because we've almost been too holy to care about that stuff. So this super spirituality has caused us to withdraw, and Western history has developed with bad ideologies. So they start to name those. There's a section where they look at economics, and they look at technology, and they look at the faith in science and progress, this motif of progress. So their cultural analysis of the ideologies of secularization and how those things have deformed us with late modern capitalism and so forth. It sounds like Wendell Berry today, maybe, and both of those guys happen to be Wendell Berry fans. But before Wendell Berry was known, they were analyzing the sort of fast-paced capitalist culture that has caused everything to be reduced to money and numbers and data and power. So they're pretty radical in their critique of the West. Well, that's the second part. So the first part is a robust Christian worldview. The second part is what happens in Western culture in modernity when you don't have that worldview. And then thirdly, okay, what are we going to do about this? We now see that God has called us to repent and live out a fuller vision of the Christian faith. And we have to do that by saying no to the ways of the ideologies of the world. So what does it look like to develop a really comprehensive plan to bring renewal to the Western world? It's an audacious task. And they have a couple of chapters for college students, that if college students, who are no better than anybody else, but they are the sort of future leaders, if these future think tank leaders that are going to be put into positions of power in a few short years are going to really turn this thing around, they've got to reject idols and develop a Christian worldview. What do they need to do in college to make that happen? And so the last couple chapters of this are how Christian students should take classes together, should develop the Christian mind, should kind of take fiction and nonfiction courses, humanities and science together. Maybe they should go to college longer than 4 years, because to be a Christian student is going to be harder than ever. And the cost of discipleship, even financially, may be hefty. So don't rush your way through college, but take your time and do it well. We at the Jubilee Conference used to talk more about this kind of stuff, academic discipleship, we used to call it, inspired by this very book. And the last couple chapters of this, of a Christian philosophical framework that would give us a basis for being good students and bringing God's renewal to the realms of scholarship, is part of what this book is so very, very special. So Creation Regained is sort of the short biblical version of this reformational worldview. And then the Transforming Vision that came out a year before it problematizes that a little bit, makes it a little more sticky by saying, okay, if you have this Christian worldview, what in the world are we going to do with it? And why didn't it take hold in the West? And why has secularization and idols deformed so much of society? Phil, I think things have only gotten worse since the time they wrote this. The secularization and the dysfunction, while we've seen glimmers of hope and good stuff in the modern world, there are dangerous problems that are worse now than ever. And so we need this Christian mind offered in this imaginative vision of a holistic Christian critique of society and what it means to live it out robustly as students. And so these are two books that really, really nail this Jubilee vision so powerfully. And in days gone by, they were almost the number one books that we would talk about the most in our CCO ministry. They're not as well known now as they used to be in CCO circles. And so if there's any CCO friends out there listening to this, I just wanted to make you aware that these really are seminal texts for our tribe, for our movement, and for our ministry.
Yeah, great. Yeah, the transforming vision, the thoughts within that, I think it's kind of the secret sauce of this worldview stuff. So, in my experience, the creation, fall, redemption, restoration worldview helped me understand like the scope of the Bible and the meta narrative of the Bible and all of life. The secret sauce is when you start to see your love of baseball and pumpkin pie and math and politics and movies and video games. When you start to really see all of that as a part of all this and an impact on all this, and you really start thinking about that, it changes the way you drink your morning coffee. It changes the way you vote. It changes the way you view your budget and your neighbor. And that's where like the secret sauce really is with the worldview stuff, in my own opinion. And I remember when this dawned on me and I started to connect this worldview stuff to my love of baseball and my love of video games and my love of movies and all the stuff that I loved at that time and some of the stuff I still love to this day. And I wept for joy, because previously my faith was spiritual stuff was over here, and literally everything else was a choice about guilty pleasures. Like, I guess it's okay. It's okay to love baseball, but the spiritual stuff is over here in my evangelism and my Bible study. And when it all came together, I wept. I left the room I was sitting in and I wept outside because I was a little ashamed to be weeping over such a thing. At the same time, it is the thing. It is the lens you were saying at the beginning of that book, this lens by which we see all things. And when that really comes into focus, really becomes the secret sauce of all this worldview stuff.
Well, that's exactly what the next book is I'm going to tell you about. But let me just circle back before I get to that one and remind you that the Transforming Vision book, as much as that is the secret sauce, it helps us understand why it's missing. And I think this is part of our sort of problem in the contemporary Christian culture, is we don't always have a view of history and a view of the past, not to be overly critical or overly philosophical, but I do think it is helpful to sort of name how we got in this mess, to sort of have a diagnosis of the problem. And they say it came in part from Augustine and Aquinas, early church fathers that bought into Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. And so I know everybody doesn't necessarily want to read Plato and Augustine, and not all of that stuff is bad. Augustine is incredibly rich, but to name how some of these bad ideologies snuck into church history, and then how that has deformed us with this sacred secular dualism that doesn't allow us to connect Sunday and Monday. And at best, you got guilty pleasures then. You can kind of like life maybe, as long as you're doing evangelism enough. But to not see all of life as worship, to know why that is, where we got into this mess, where we went wrong, this helps us diagnose that problem and the history of dualism. And then the consequences of that, with the secularization and the militarism and the economy and the technology, you wonder about AI and stuff now. The roots of that are explored and named as idols in this book. So I think it's, in a certain sense, prophetic, and it's a good bit of history and culture that we sort of need if we're going to be serious diagnosticians to understand the architecture of our society. So before we jump into the glory of the joy of serving a good pumpkin pie for the glory of the Lord, let's back up a little and do a little academic research on the history of why we don't get that. Maybe we can get it just by having a robust vision of the Bible. But I think for many of us, particularly in academic arenas, we need to sort of know the history and philosophy and the development of the problems of our day. And both the history of dualism in the church and the history of secularization in the modern Western world, and then the call to be Christian thinkers in the academy. That's what sets this book apart from nearly any other book that I know. So that's good stuff. Now, to get to the joy of it all, this is the final one I'll mention today. It is called Heaven is not my home. Paul Marshall, who taught at the Institute for Christian Studies as well, he was part of this whole gang with Al Wolters and Brian Walsh, thinking Christianly about a redemptive vision of all of life. He was challenged by actually our friend Oz Guinness to write a practical guide to what it looks like to have an embodied sort of Christian living day by day by day in every zone of life. So with lots of great stories and lots of great fun and lots of great insight, Paul suggested again that the gospel is not just that Jesus died for your sins, but it's that the reign of God is coming, the kingdom is coming, and the kingdom is described as creation regained, as paradise restored, as all of life being healed. And so again, creation, fall, redemption is part of this book as it looks at the breadth of creation and the seriousness of the fall and the glories of the breadth of redemption and the scope of God's work. But then he begins to work it all out. So there's a chapter on business. There's a chapter on work. There's a chapter on play. There's a chapter on rest. There's a chapter on science. There's a chapter called The Wonder of Learning. So whether it's the wonder of learning and the joy of learning, or whether it's the glory of labor and work, or whether it's the pleasures of play, he looks at all this kind of stuff, the tasks in our world to work in the natural world, our political responsibilities. There's a great chapter on the arts. There's a chapter called Creativity and Technology, suggesting that technology is not just sort of turning our humanity over to robots, but actually being creative as we design technology in aesthetically pleasing and human scale terms. So the stuff about creativity is just wonderful. The stuff about technology, although a little dated because he doesn't talk about computers and stuff, but it is the basis of just what we need. I adore this book. Some people don't like the title, Heaven is Not My Home. But biblically, he's right. We're not designed to go to heaven and wear halos all day. At the end of the Bible, Jesus comes back and he restores the world and brings the new Jerusalem to earth. So we live in a heavenly, call it that, heavenly city, a new creation, as it's often called. So heaven is not our home. We're designed to live forever on the earth in a restored new creation. So he gets at that quite nicely. His chapter on the new creation is beautiful. His chapter on patience and long suffering is worth the price of the book, that we have to suffer to make this happen. God will do what God will do in his own good time. And it's not us to build the kingdom, really. We just bear witness to the hints of hope that we have through faithful obedience. There's a chapter on evangelism in here that I think is wonderful. Many CCO people haven't kind of remembered that. But in this all of life redeemed stuff, he has a chapter on worship and he has a chapter on evangelism. And he suggests in those two chapters that once you have this broad, visionary, and very joyful, practical living in the world vision of what the kingdom is, then worship becomes that much more beautiful and fun as you're joyously ascribing to the Lord the beauty of his name, because he is so much bigger than we ever knew. You can worship a puny God if you want, and a Jesus that saves your soul if you want. But the biblical God and the Jesus who is King of creation is so much bigger and worthy. And so worship becomes that much more meaningful. And evangelism, likewise, is not just merely trying to convince somebody to believe in God. Anybody can do that. Or to get saved and join the church. Anybody can do that. But we're recruiting people for this life-saving mission of transforming everything. What an exciting and audacious religion we've got. John 10:10 says, Jesus came that we might have life and have it abundantly. Well, when that's our abundant vision, then inviting people to that is amazing evangelism. And so evangelism and worship become that much more exciting and, frankly, that much more challenging as we figure out what it looks like to worship well and share the gospel well as we recruit people to join this movement of a reformational worldview. I love this book. It's practical. It's easy to read. There's stories. There's commonplace, ordinary stuff to enjoy, like you were talking about pumpkin pie, Phil. This is where it all leads. Once we get the biblical basis that Al Wolters has taught us, and once we have the kind of cultural analysis that Walsh and Middleton give us, then we get down to the joy of living it out as ordinary people in the real world. And so these are three books that sort of have been quintessentially Jubilee, that have been important to the conference by authors that have been at the conference. And so I think these, of perhaps any books of the last 50 years, have shaped the ethos of the CCO and the vision of the Jubilee Conference, maybe more than anything. And so I hope people get a kick out of these books, hearing these stories, and might be inspired to pick them up again if you've not read them in a while, or if this is new to you, to place an order, because these books can change the world.
That's awesome. We for New Year's Eve, I don't know what most people talk about at New Year's Eve, but if it's reflecting or making resolutions, it wasn't what my friends were talking about. We were talking about what will it be like to age in the kingdom to come. And it came back to like, man, what would it look like to really perfect a cup of coffee? What would it look like to really dive into board games throughout history and, and development? And what would it look like to actually like love learning and to go traveling and will we be able to transport? Would we want to be able to transport? Like, what if we actually just really love the drive, the journey itself in the age to come? And all of these were fueled by a vision that heaven is not our home. It's this wonderful confluence of heaven here on earth, and not wanting to just write it off that we'll just be able to just fly wherever, or just to zoom here and experience that. Like, it really was this translation of, well, gosh, it's going to look a lot like what we do now, but unhindered and beautified and whatever other words we want to do. So I love that title for that sake, because it prods at the very thing that I know I feared about heaven. I feared heaven was going to be boring and was just going to be just harps and naked baby angels. But it's just so much more than that when you start to really digest this worldview stuff and start to see it as a lens to current day life and then everlasting life. Any final thoughts before
Phil,
I take us home?
Asking those kind of questions is that it shows you really get it when you start saying, what will the new creation be like? When you fall, will you skin your knee? I mean, blood is a good thing, right? Jesus had blood in his body. They ate breakfast in his resurrected body. And so what will it be like to live in a new creation that's as it was always meant to be? We can't even imagine. And then with the presence of Jesus right there amongst us, it's going to be great. So this is the kind of stuff that I think energizes the CCO, and the Jubilee Conference helps students work it out in terms of their own majors and their own future careers. This is exciting stuff for me, and I'm really glad to get to talk about these books, Phil. And I'm so glad you bring such a practical angle to it all. It's really a joy talking with you.
Well, I love to do it, and to make it even more practical for our listeners, I'll make sure that links to the Jubilee Conference and to things like the Institute for Christian Studies makes it into the description. Of course, there'll be links to us. If you want to communicate with us, we'll have our email addresses in there. We would love if you took the show and shared it and liked it. That helps us grow our audience and get these books out there, because, of course, we want you to read these books. And so make sure that you check out the show description for all that. And to read these books, you don't have to go to the Jubilee Conference. We would love if you attended the Jubilee Conference. But the order form for these books and any other books that might be on your radar will be the very first link you see in the description as well. So please do make sure to pause, check out the show description, share and like this episode on whatever platform you're listening to. We'd really appreciate that. So on behalf of Byron and Hearts and Minds, as well as myself and the CCO, thanks again for listening to another episode of the 3 Books from Hearts and Minds podcast.